Welcome everyone to season 3 of National Park Service Presents. As I was saying before, not supposed to have a favorite child, but this is my favorite child, and it probably always will be. It is an entirely online series that runs every other Wednesday. We started around January, and we're running this one all the way until April 26th, the end of April. And this series covers a whole multitude of topics, but tonight's is focusing on environmental justice, especially around the Boston Harbor Islands. Before we begin, though, we're going to go over some of the boring Zoom things. This one is not boring because I get questions on it. Karen, are you recording? Yes, we are. We are recording. And we have it all up on the Boston Public Library YouTube page. You can Google Boston Public Library YouTube and it will be there. I will also throw the link in the chat. You can see this season's, last season's, and some of our very first ones. If you do not enjoy the captions that are coming up on the bottom of your screen, you can click the CC below and turn off your closed captions. Also down below in the navigation bar is the chat bubble. The chat bubble is a place where you can ask all of your questions. It's a rare webinar where we keep the chat open, but honestly, all of you people are so wonderful and kind and have such great questions that we keep it open. We don't need you to be shy. We love your questions. We just ask you to be respectful, please. And if you notice the to form, when you type your questions in, you can either get sent to panelists and hosts, meaning myself and the people you can see on the screen, or you can send it to everyone, which is everyone, screen and people back home. So just be aware of that. The questions will be asked at the end. Ranger Sean's moderating the chat, and he will kind of be looking through the chat. And at the end, he'll pop on the screen and ask Ranger Amelia all of your wonderful questions, just so we don't interrupt her flow. And I think that is me. Without further ado, let's welcome Ranger Amelia as she presents environmental justice in the Boston Harbor Islands.
Thank you, Karen. I just want to double check that everyone can see this screen and not the chat or anything else. Okay, awesome. All right, so I would like to get us started off with a land acknowledgement. This is how we like to start all of our programs. So the Boston Harbor Islands Partnership acknowledges that we are on the ancestral territory of the Massachusetts tribe, who have lived on and cared for this land and water for thousands of years and who continue to live here and care for this place today. There we go. So as Karen mentioned, my name is Amelia Benstead. I work for the National Parks of Boston. Has anyone here ever been to what they think the National Parks of Boston are, or the Boston Harbor Islands? If you want to throw that in the chat, I'd love to see if anyone's been in our park. But while you're doing that, I will just kind of briefly explain to you the National Parks of Boston is actually a constellation of 3 different independently legislated parks. So we have Boston National Historical Park. That's the image you see there in the center of your screen. That's Faneuil Hall. If you've ever been out on the Freedom Trail or kind of exploring Revolutionary War history in Boston, then you have most likely been to Boston National. On the left-hand side of your screen, that is the Robert Gould Shaw Memorial, and that represents Boston African American National Historic Site. And that site is located on the north slope of Beacon Hill, and it really focuses on 19th century slavery and abolition in Boston. And then on the right-hand side of your screen, that photo represents the Boston Harbor Islands. We have 34 islands and peninsulas out in Boston Harbor, many of which you can visit on the public ferry. I see in the chat that several of you have been out there, which is fantastic. We hope to see you out there again this summer. And our islands are home to a variety of natural, cultural, and historical resources. So today, we're going to be talking about the intersection of those Boston Harbor Islands with environmental justice. So we're going to kind of walk through a historic overview of how different groups have used the islands over time. We're going to look at roughly the last 400 or so years. And then we're also going to look at how the islands are being activated and shared today, and see how environmental justice and equity and all of that good stuff kind of fits into the narrative for us here at the islands. So without further ado, we're going to just really quickly, we're going to go all the way back to the beginning, because I think it is really important to understand why, part of the reason why the islands are so important. So let's talk about how the islands actually formed. As some of you might know, the islands formed at the end of the last glacial period, which was for quite some time. So it starts 95,000 years ago and it ends about 11,500 years ago. And during that time, something called the Laurentide ice sheet is actually covering a lot of North America, including this area that we live in today. So that's the image that you're seeing on the left-hand side of the screen. Now, when the ice begins to melt and recede, it's going to leave these kind of lumps of glacial debris, so soil, rocks, all kind of churned up and mixed together in teardrop-shaped mounds that are called drumlins. And so initially, this area full of all these mounds that we know as drumlins would have been above sea level. And as the ice is slowly receding and melting, the land has been really compressed for several thousand years underneath the weight of the ice. And so then as that ice leaves, the land kind of rebounds, almost the way the land kind of wobbles during an earthquake. If you think about that kind of movement, it's doing that really slowly. And then it kind of settles. And as the ice continues melting, it starts to fill up these valleys in between the drumlins in this area. So it partially drowns the drumlins. They become islands in that time. So the Boston Harbor Islands are actually the only partially drowned drumlin field in North America, which makes this, we think, pretty interesting and important. The other partially drowned drumlin field that we are aware of is actually in Clew Bay in Ireland. So we're really lucky to have this resource here in our own backyard. Now, the image on the right that you see, that was taken from Spectacle Island, which is initially formed by drumlins, but it's very much remodeled in the 1990s. And we'll talk about that a little later, but it gives you a great perspective of Moon Island, which you can see is very thickly wooded. And you can just kind of make out that gentle mounded teardrop shape. So Moon's actually a really good example of a drumlin. So these islands, they actually start as Indigenous spaces. We know that Indigenous Americans have been in this area for thousands of years, really since time immemorial. And that image that you're looking at on the right-hand side of your screen is actually from a very cool resource. It's called Native Land. And it is seeking to really map all the locations of Indigenous peoples around the world. So if you're not aware of whose land you live on, this is a really great resource to go and check out. So when we look at Massachusetts, there's a couple of things we notice right off the bat. Very, very heavily populated. There's a lot of different tribes in this area. And a lot of those tribes do still remain today. We also know that the coastline is very different a couple thousand years ago than it is today. Because remember, we talked about that ice melting and the water kind of filling up that drumlin field. So we also know that the Indigenous population in this area, many of whom would have been from the Massachusetts tribe, they actually initially would have lived much farther east than where we are today. And unfortunately, because that area is now part of the ocean, we really don't have access to a lot of those sites that we anticipate would be archaeological sites. Really, some of the first information we have on an archaeological level about where the Massachusetts are living in this area is on the islands. So they would have started out in the area we kind of know as the ocean off the coast of Massachusetts. And as that water rises, they're moving slowly back to what we know as the present day coastline. And as they're doing that, they're holding their lands in common. There's a lot of communal land use. You see on this map that a lot of tribes, they have overlapping areas. And that's because they have a real system of sharing land and moving seasonally. So the islands we know would have been used as seasonal hunting and fishing grounds by Indigenous people in the area. That image on the left-hand side of your screen is actually a shell midden on Spectacle Island that was excavated and kind of examined. So a midden is really just kind of a collection of shells and bones. It's really like a garbage deposit, for lack of a better term. But just the way we like to excavate outhouses, we do the same thing with middens, and they kind of show us what people are eating and where they're living and what their lifestyle looks like. Now we know that when Indigenous people are living on this land, and this continues today, they have a really deep respect for the land, for the water, for all it provides. They are really approaching their relationship with this space through the lens of reciprocity and respect. And that really means things like taking care of the land and only using the resources that you need in that moment, and really trying to preserve and honor that space as it is ecologically meant to be. Now, that sounds like a really wonderful, in my opinion, that sounds like a really wonderful example of environmental justice, really honoring the space as it's meant to be, as it was created in nature. And so the way that Indigenous people are living on the lands, it's a really great early example of environmental justice and sharing those resources and those spaces between many diverse peoples. Now, unfortunately, that's going to change a bit when we have Europeans arriving in this area in the early 1600s. So we've got a couple different images that I'm going to walk you through here. But essentially, when Europeans arrive in this area in the 1620s, they get here and they see from the boat what they think looks like a really rugged, wild, untouched space. They see just a landscape that is in many areas very thickly wooded. And while they are perceiving that as, uninhabited space, untouched space, what they're really looking at is a really carefully maintained Indigenous landscape where those communities are really taking their cues from nature, and by rotating through different homes and hunting and fishing grounds are really preserving that nature as it was intended. So they kind of look at the islands, the coastline, and they see this really great property on the water. Remember, water is really valuable for transport at this time. And they see an abundance of resources. And unfortunately, European colonizers are really going to kind of take this view of othering when it comes to the islands. So they're going to take up residence in Boston, on what is labeled on your screens as the Shawmut Peninsula. And that's the original landmass in Boston. So they're not actually living on the islands at first, but they are really going to look to the islands as these kind of sources of boundless resources. So some islands are completely clear cut for wood so that they can build and heat their homes. Shipbuilding is a huge industry at this point. Other islands, they're going to fall into private ownership. When we look at that map on the left-hand side of your screen, it's kind of depicting for you the transformation of the land. So one of the things that we know about European arrival here is that it will drastically alter the shape of the land, how the land is used, how it's owned, and it is going to forever change the lives of the Indigenous peoples who were residing here and do still reside here today. So that darkest green that you see on your screen, that's the original landmass in Boston. So we see that Boston's much smaller than it is today. There's a lot more water. The islands appear much farther out into the harbor. When you look at Spectacle Island, you can see that it looks a lot smaller now than it does, or a lot smaller then than it does today. So almost as soon as they get here, the Europeans start running out of space. Boston's a pretty compact and densely populated area. So they start to kind of build out. They start reclaiming marshlands. They start filling it in with trash, with dead animals, with dirt from other kind of larger hills in Boston. And we know that the most dramatic land change is actually going to happen in the 1800s. Just to kind of give you an example of what's happening here, for those of you who have walked up Beacon Hill, it's a sizable hill, and depending on the sources you look at, in the early 1800s, it used to be between 40 and 60 feet taller than it is today. And that's because in the early 1800s, they actually shovel off the top of the hill and they use it to fill in the area behind or on top of which now sits TD Garden, which was a salt marsh at that point. And that is what is happening all over this kind of coastal section of what we now know as Boston. And one of the other things that they start to do is they really continue with that thought process of othering the island. So if you have an industry or a person or a group of people that you don't really want in Boston because maybe they pollute the land or they have different viewpoints that you perceive as dangerous, they're going to really look to the islands as these spaces apart from Boston that can be used to kind of take care of those messier portions of their lives. And one of the really good examples of this is using the islands as quarantine spaces. And those are the images that you see on the right-hand side of your screen. So in the 1600s, not long after they arrive here, Boston actually does start using some of the islands as quarantine spaces. The first one is actually going to be Castle Island, which you can see is right there in the center of that map. It used to actually be an island and today is fully connected to South Boston. So as our trade starts to increase throughout the 1700s with the West Indies, with South America, Africa, Europe, that means that there are a lot more diseases being imported into what was then the town of Boston. Things like smallpox, which are highly contagious and deadly. So Boston really wants smallpox victims to be quarantined away from the general population of Boston. And what better place to do that than on these islands that are just kind of sitting out in the harbor, waiting for someone to use them. So there are a variety of quarantine shelters built on the islands over the course of the 1700s and the 1800s. Spectacle Island has one of the earliest quarantine facilities. Rainsford Island, which is that image you see on the bottom, has a slightly later facility. But the idea of the use of the islands in this way is that as you are a ship coming into Boston, you have to stop. Your ship and your population has to be inspected by a health inspector. And then you have to lay and wait in quarantine for a certain amount of time until your ship's population can be deemed healthy. It's important to remember that there is certainly some classes into this. So often first-class passengers were just kind of considered clean because they were in first class, while people in second, third class would have had to wait for that full quarantine period on the ships and on the islands. Now, the 1800s really kind of pushed this use of the islands to a peak. In the 1800s, we know that we start getting a huge influx of Irish immigrants to this area. And that's largely because in Ireland, you have throughout the 1700s a series of famines, there's poor economic conditions, there's religious oppression, so not the best living standards, and that really peaks in the 1800s with the potato famine in Ireland. So during this time, Deer Island actually becomes one of the key hubs for quarantining people. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about the Indigenous internment on Deer Island that takes place in the 1600s. The quarantine facility that the Irish are going to be interned at, that's not established until 1849. But it's really important to remember that during King Philip's War, in the winter of 1675 to 1676, between 758 and 1,065 Christian Indigenous people were forcibly removed from the greater Boston area to Deer Island, where they endured deeply inhumane living conditions. Those conditions were so brutal that between 48 and 52% of people actually died on Deer Island. So it's really important to recognize Deer Island as this place of trauma and suffering for the local Indigenous communities, and to note that that othering and that space of exile really does continue into the 19th century when we start to see the Irish immigrants being interned there and having to wait to be deemed clean and healthy to enter the city of Boston. Now, over the course of this time, we have the islands being used primarily for othering spaces, but it's not just people that we're sending out there. We actually end up with one of the dirtiest harbors in the nation because of how we treat Boston Harbor Islands. So that image on the left of your screen, that's Spectacle Island in the 1800s. Spectacle Island is really interesting because it's located very close to Boston itself, so it's very easy to get back and forth. And so because of that, it really does become a prime location for some of those industries that we don't necessarily want to have in downtown Boston because they smell or they're messy or they pollute. So they all end up on Spectacle Island. Not all, a lot of them. So you have things like horse rendering factories. Boston at this time largely relies on horses for transportation. So when a horse dies in Boston, there's not a lot of places to send it on the mainland. So a company opens up and they start sending those dead horses on barges out to Spectacle Island, where they're kind of recycled, and a bunch of different products such as glue are actually made out of their remains, which is pretty grim. But so you have a horse rendering factory, you have a glue factory. You have these industries that we don't want on the mainland because they're going to impede your enjoyment of the land. They're going to pollute it. And on Spectacle Island and in other places along the waterfront, there's not a ton of legislation restricting what's being dumped into the water. Which kind of brings us back to Deer Island. So as you might know, today there's a beautiful state-of-the-art sewage treatment plant on Deer Island, but unfortunately that doesn't come till much later. At this point, the images you're looking at right now, raw sewage is actually being discharged directly into Boston Harbor. So we can imagine what a difference that would have made to the cleanliness of the harbor. Now, in addition, Spectacle Island is going to function as a city of Boston's landfill at the beginning of the 20th century, and that's not going to close until 1959. So pretty recent memory there. Waterfront property is nowhere near as valuable as it is today. You wouldn't want to fish or swim in the harbor at this point. We have records of people in living memory talking about the stench in downtown Boston when the tide went out. Or the wind blew in a certain direction. So Boston in the 20th century up through the 1980s, their harbor looks drastically different than it is today. And that image you see on the right-hand side of your screen is a newspaper cover from the late 1980s when we had the dirtiest harbor in the nation, and it was called the Harbor of Shame. So when we consider what the harbor looks like now, we can easily tell that there has been a huge project to clean up the harbor. There's been a dramatic transformation. So in the 1980s, we have a kind of confluence of different events taking place. There's a larger environmental justice movement going on in the country. The Spectacle Island landfill, which for decades now has just been kind of leaching trash and toxins into the water and spontaneously having small fires on it. The city is actually going to decide to cap that landfill. They're going to close it, seal it, and then with dirt from the big dig, they are going to take about 3.5 million cubic yards of clay, dirt, and gravel that they're excavating while they're building the tunnels that now run under downtown Boston. And they're going to barge that out to Spectacle Island, where they use it to put on top of that capped landfill and really reshape the island and give it kind of a completely new shot at being a healthy space and contributing to a healthy harbor. So the other thing that's happening, we talked about Deer Island's state-of-the-art sewage treatment plant. This sewage treatment plant comes on in 1995 in a partial capacity, and then in 2000 it is fully up to speed and working. So Deer Island services about 43 communities in the greater Boston area. It takes the sewage, it sends them through digesters, it removes all of the toxins, and then it actually pumps what remains, which is safe to be pumped into the environment at this point, about 9.5 miles out past Deer Island into the ocean. And that makes a tremendous difference too in what the harbor kind of becomes. So the images you're looking at now, on your right, that is a photo of the harbor and Spectacle Island from the last couple of years. And on your left, that is an image from when Spectacle Island is being replanted. So if you kind of compare those two images, you can see that the space where that volunteer is planting seagrass would have been a little to the left of the dock that you see on the front of Spectacle Island today. And for those of you who have been to Spectacle Island, you can vouch that it looks completely different from the way it looked in the early 20th century. It's an incredible story of environmental rejuvenation and restoration. And with that in mind, I want to talk to you a little about the Boston Harbor Islands today. And now that we have this really full understanding of kind of the history of how we go from this beautiful, pristine, indigenous maintained landscape to this kind of exploited and othered colonial landscape up through the early 20th century. And then we finally worked through that environmental restoration in the last 30 years or so. I want to talk to you about what environmental justice looks like for Bostonians today, really look at the use of access to the islands as its own form of environmental justice, because this is an incredible natural, cultural, historical resource. And it really is kind of a reflection of what the city of Boston has gone through over the last 400 years. So we strive for equitable access at the Boston Harbor Islands. It's at the core of what we do here. We really do believe that the islands are a public space that should be enjoyed by all Bostonians. We really do work to try and get as many people out there at an affordable rate as possible. But kind of the flip side to equitable access is barriers. And there are a lot of barriers for local Bostonians to enjoy the islands. So I'm going to just walk you through a couple of them now. Tickets to the Boston Harbor Islands on the ferry, a round trip ticket's about $25 for an adult and about $18 for a child. When we talk about how we advertise the islands, a lot of the language of the advertising and the programming we offer of how to use the ferry is done in English. 66% of Bostonians only speak English, but then there are about 5 other languages that are spoken almost as much as English in different parts of the city. And those are Spanish, Portuguese, Haitian Creole, Vietnamese, Chinese, and Cape Verdean, so 6. So those are very different from the languages we're advertising in, which makes it a little harder for people to learn about the programming we offer and how to get out to the islands. The other things to consider, they're islands, so you have to travel to them. You can take public transit, but you have to understand the public transit system. Remember, the public transit system's largely in English. Maybe you want to drive. Parking can be really expensive and hard to find in downtown Boston. It can be stressful and slow because we've got a lot of traffic here. And so there's a lot of factors that really do contribute to why people might not come out to the islands or might not perceive the islands as their own environmental space to recreate in, to relax in, and to learn about their city and their city's history. We do try to really mitigate those barriers, and we do so in a variety of ways. So we offer options both in person and remote for people. So the images you're looking at are in-person options. On the left-hand side of your screen, this is an image from one of our mini grants that took place last summer. So this is a newer program where we are offering kind of smaller grants to community leaders and organizers so that they can build and serve programming to their communities, to their constituents on the islands in the way that is going to best entice their constituents to come out to the islands, to feel safe and supported, and like that is their space. So this is a program we're super excited about because it helps to build those foundational relationships through a lot of the waterfront communities in Boston and our park, even when language might be a bit of a barrier. And then on the right, this is an image from a community cruise. So each summer we offer a series of community cruises for different waterfront communities. So there's a Chinatown cruise, there's an East Boston cruise, all of those locations that we think about as really bordering the harbor and bearing witness to the harbor's evolution. Those are the communities that we're trying to get out on these free cruises where they can enjoy dinner, where they can see the islands, start to understand what the islands mean to the city, where they might fit into them. And it's a really incredible opportunity to kind of connect with those communities and start building a foundational relationship with them. There's a lot of other things too that are in place. So we have the Island Pass program, which provides free access to underserved populations in the area. Last year, we were able to award about 12,500 tickets, ferry tickets to the islands, which is huge. There are programs that provide access to the island that are reduced costs, things like the Library Pass program. There's over 100 libraries, and you can get reduced cost ferry tickets through your local library if you live in the greater Boston area. We work with a variety of organizations. The Boston Harbor Islands is a national estate park, and at its core, it is a partnership park. So there are 11 kind of key partners at the table who all kind of work together to support these programs, to try and mitigate these barriers and really make the islands a space for everyone to enjoy. We offer junior ranger activities, both online and in person. So we have junior ranger books in those 5 key languages that we know are the most spoken languages by Bostonians outside of English. And then one of the other really key things we do is we try really hard to be good stewards of the land. So of course, there's a lot left to learn. There's a lot that has been learned, but our science and stewardship partnerships team, along with the Stone Living Lab, are really kind of at the forefront of this. So the Stone Living Lab is really kind of working on understanding what climate change means for our park. Are there ways we can mitigate it and protect these spaces? Is this a space that needs to just kind of be, we need to accept that climate change is going to change it in a permanent way. And our our science and stewardship partnerships teams, they also work with that science, and then they do a lot of really hands-on work with the islands. They do a lot of invasive plant management. They replant native plants. They survey and monitor the quantity of native and non-native species, which are all really important things to maintaining a healthy ecosystem and an enduring islands ecosystem out there. One of the other things they do is they work really closely with volunteers on a regular basis. If anyone's ever attended a stewardship Saturday, you've been a part of this. But our natural resources team takes out volunteers every other week, and they kind of teach them how to manage the plants and work on whatever project they're doing out there. And it's an incredible program because it really allows people to get out into their park, to have a vested interest in it, to contribute as a steward of that space. And it supports our park too, because you can do much more with the help of others than you can do with just the people we have working for our park. And then we're just going to close off, with a couple closing thoughts, and then I'll open it up for questions. But I would really like to invite you to consider what environmental justice means to you as it relates to the Harbor Islands. For us, it means a lot of trying to provide equitable access to honoring these ecosystems as healthy ecosystems, and to really making sure that everyone is able to access this place as a place of respite and relaxation and learning. But I would love to hear from all of you what this intersection really means to you. So with that, thank you so much for joining us and for listening, and I will stop sharing my screen so that we can jump into some questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much, Amelia, for your presentation. Definitely, hard to cram 400 years of history into a half-hour program, but I think you did a great job there. So feel free, folks, if you do have any additional questions, you can drop them in the chat as we continue. But for right now, I had start off with a couple questions here. So do you know of any memorials on Deer Island, either to the indigenous communities that were interned there or to the Irish who died there during quarantine?
That's a great question. I'm actually going to defer to you on this one, Sean, because I know you've done a bit more research than I have on Deer Island.
Back and forth. Yeah, so as far as my knowledge, there is one to the Irish who died on Deer Island, and then there are interpretive signs on Deer Island that do speak to the internment of indigenous peoples out there, but I do not believe that there is a specific memorial to them on Deer Island in those that were interned during King Philip's War. So there is information about it, but not, to my knowledge anyway, a specific memorial.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things to consider too is traditionally we really think of memorials as like a stone monument with some information on it. But there are many ways to memorialize something that happened, and one of those is including information about that in the programming you're offering. So we really do try as much as possible to respect what happened there and continue that public memory of it by including that in our programs as well.
Yeah, great. So had another question that actually just came in. And I think that you can answer this as well. So the public can visit Deer Island. How do you get there? How does that work?
Yeah, you have to contend with Boston traffic if you drive at the wrong time of day. But yes, the public can visit Boston. There is a smaller parking lot outside the gates of Deer Island. So parts of the island are closed to visitors because there's a massive sewage treatment plant there. So that's a bit of a security concern. But there's actually a beautiful walking trail that goes around the perimeter of Deer Island. You can walk, you can run, you can bike. You can just sit on one of the benches and enjoy the view of the harbor. And then as Sean mentioned too, there are those interpretive waysides if you want to learn a little bit more about the history of those who came before you and the harbor in general.
Awesome. So again, I don't know if you totally have the answer to this question, which I think is definitely fine. But has there ever been any discussion about returning some of the islands or spaces on the islands to Native peoples?
Ooh, that's a really tricky question. I'm not even going to try and answer that because I don't think I have access to all of the nitty-gritty details on that. What I will say is that the National Parks of Boston is really invested in building a lasting and enduring relationship with the Massachusetts tribe. That is a very deliberate process that takes time. Relationship building with Indigenous communities can often look different from the type of relationship building we are used to. But the park is absolutely committed to learning from the Massachusetts, to trying to work in tandem with them to present the best, most holistic interpretation of these spaces. And I will leave it there for now.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great answer. So thank you. Wondering, could you just speak a little bit to your research process, kind of how you pulled this together, some of the sources you consulted, just a little bit more to your methodology?
Sure. I have sources from all over the place. When you do research for the Harbor Islands, especially if you're kind of spanning a long period of time, it's really hard to just kind of find one compendium of knowledge. So quarantine information. I used a lot of historical newspapers. There's also a fantastic book all about quarantine in the Boston Harbor Islands. I think Sean's probably going to drop the link in the chat. But that really is one of the premier sources on Boston Harbor's quarantine process. Generally, old newspapers have been a really fantastic source of research for me. Some articles from other historians, academic historians. I was digging through NASA's website actually to better understand the Laurentide ice sheet, because I am not a geologist by training. Yep, there's the book Germs at Bay by Charles Vidic. So really they come from all over. We try as much as possible when we do something like this to make sure we're incorporating a lot of primary sources, which are those sources that were authored by the people who were there in that moment. Photos are super helpful too with Spectacle Island and kind of understanding the evolution of the space. And then if anybody is familiar with Joe Bagley, he is the archaeologist for the city of Boston, and he has some fantastic information on kind of Indigenous presence beyond and on the island, and the geologic formation of this space as well.
Great. So a couple other questions coming in. And again, if you don't know the totality of this answer, I think that's totally fine. But how much of the islands are likely to be submerged due to climate change and sea level rise?
Wow. That's a tough one. I don't have a figure for you. That's a little outside my area of expertise. What I can tell you is that I believe last year, we were designated as one of the most endangered, like one of the top 10 most endangered parks in the country. So parts of the islands are eroding at up to a rate of 3 feet per year. That doesn't mean that that's the case with all of them. What's really important to understand about these islands in the context of climate change is that these are, yes, they're partially drowned drumlin field, but they are made up of sediments, and they are barrier islands. So they are meant to really protect the mainland, Boston, its coastal communities from the full force and impact of storms. And we actually have another program that's starting at 7 o'clock, all about winter storms and the Boston Harbor Islands, if you really want to deep dive into this topic. But the nature of a barrier island is that it is going to erode in some spaces, it's going to grow in other spaces as it kind of sits there and absorbs the impact of storms and different tides and currents. So when we look at Spectacle Island, one of the beach to the right of the pier, has actually gotten significantly larger over the last 20 or so years because of the way the current carries sediment down to it. And then if you look at Lovell's Island, you can see some really clear erosion that has taken place just in the last 5 years from those intensifying storms.
Great. Great answer to a complicated question. Thank you. All right. So unfortunately, I think we only have time for one more. I did see one come in regarding just Deer Island in general, and it was a quick one. So is Deer Island, do you speak to, is it a part of the national park?
Yeah, this is a really complicated question just in general with the islands. The 34 islands and peninsulas, which includes Deer Island, are all considered part of the national and the state park. Deer Island is owned and operated by the Massachusetts Water Resource Authority. They are the folks who take care of the Deer Island sewage treatment plant. So it is part of the national park. It's also part of the state park, and it's also part of Massachusetts Water Resource Authority.
Very embedded in partnership, which is definitely what a lot of the national parks of Boston is. Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much, Amelia. Really appreciate you taking the time here and sharing with us your knowledge and the resources as well. I want to turn it back over to Karen here to close us out.
taking it all in, just taking in the history. Because that really was like a 400-year history in like a half hour. It was right. And it was just so good. I'm just obsessed. I love it every year. Also, fun fact about me, I'm looking to buy a place. And I was looking in Winthrop and I was like, oh, Deer Island is gorgeous. That's very exciting. Thank you everyone for joining us today on this very nice Wednesday. Honestly, the sun is still out. It is still shining. You can also move those joints for a quick walk outside if you'd like. But please make sure you join us again in 2 weeks when we have our next one. You know, when you put it, there it is. Our next one will be Temples of Refuge, Boston, New Bedford, and the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 on April 12th at 6 p.m. And when I wave goodbye, wonderful survey is going to pop up. And if you could take it, that would be awesome. So I can get better at this and presenting information that all of you guys want. Anyway. I'm just so zen out and also overjoyed by the amazing presentation. I love this so much. Thank you everyone for joining us and we hope to see you in 2 weeks.